What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip. And today on the podcast, we are joined by Dr. Samuel Davidson. He's a postdoctoral fellow for digital learning and continuing education at Princeton Theological Seminary, a constructive theologian. We're having a conversation about his big research project for his dissertation, which is currently turning into a book. That is Deep Ecology, Connecting with Deep Ecclesiology. Or, better said, how do we understand the church theologically and what it's like to embody the Christian tradition in light of our growing awareness of our impact and the dependence between us as a species and the rest of creation. It is a fun and fascinating read. I'm excited to get to talk to Samuel about it. And part of what I think is really important, and you'll hear us discuss this in this episode, is that he takes the Christian tradition, the form of Christian reflection in orthodox and creedal ways, and then asks, how can the form of Christianity be understood anew in light of our greater understanding of these concepts, right? Just how our concept of God, we came to understand more as Christians as we trusted God's revelation in Christ. So too, we need to understand our nature, our mission, our task as Christians, God's relationship to this world as we come to understand the goodness and connectedness of all creation. Is a fascinating and powerful task. And for those of you that listen to the podcast regularly, this would be kind of a different way of responding to the ecological crisis theologically than some of the others that come on that might not just pick up and operate within the bounds and grammar of Christian orthodoxy. So we talk a bit about that, but it is it's fun if you're a constructive theologian to see how these different approaches work. And also, one of the cool elements about this is he's helping pioneer, as part of his postdoc at Princeton, their online education, a kind of short online offerings that are built to give the graduate school experience for lifelong learners. So the reason we ended up talking about the book that's going to be coming out of his dissertation is because the first of the big seminars that he's helping put together there is called Christ Creation in the Church, Explorations in Eco-theology. All the info for linking up and finding more about it will be on the post for this, so you can scroll down, link and such. But in addition to his class, they're doing one, say, like on Simone Weil about being a mystic in dark times, or using the text of Augustine to think politically with them. And they're going to continue to offer more and more classes in this way. So if you want to get a taste of Princeton faculty, that kind of reflection, check it out. And if you want to hang out at Princeton, then maybe come hang out with me, Andy Root, Hartmut Rosa, Gerardo Marty, John Swinton, Miroslav Volf. It's going to be a good old time because I'm heading out to Princeton for an event. And that's right, Monday, September 23rd and 24th, Hartmut Rosa, German sociologist, is going to be in the house hanging out with a bunch of theology nerds thinking about his work and what it looks like to engage it. The Bart Center at Princeton is hosting it. But it's in partnership with St. Andrews and Luther Theological Seminary out in the Twin Cities, which is where I'm visiting professor. Anyway, that Monday night, the 23rd, even if you can't come to the whole event, that night, 8 p.m. at McKay Dining Hall at Princeton Theological Seminary, there's going to be a live podcast. That's right. And if you want to be at the Live Homebrewed podcast there at Princeton on the 23rd, come on out. We're going to put links and info up. But you don't have to be going to the conference to come to the podcast. And when I got a message from Kate, who is the director of the Bart Center, she said, we got it approved to have beer on the campus at Princeton. And they haven't done this before. I said, whoa. Then we have to make sure all the homebrewed peeps in the area know so they can come out. So Princeton should have a very positive experience having craft beverages shared while having high-quality conversations with a legendary German sociologist. I'm just saying, and you could be a part of that. And it's going to be fun. My friend of the pod, Sarah Lane Ritchie, will be there. And so that's like Tim Whitaker from the New Evangelicals, I think, is coming up to hang out. So, come on out. September 23rd, 8 p.m. at Princeton. And remember to check out our partners right for this episode, because they are partnering with us at Theology Beer Camp, is Samuel Davidson's big project that he's working on right now at Princeton in online and digital learning. So check it out. Consider joining up for Christ, creation, and the church explorations in eco-theology. When you get done hearing our nerdy conversations, you will have a taste of just what's in store for those that join up. And all right, so enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today on the podcast is Samuel Davidson, who is going to be taking up very, very soon stewardship over a whole bunch of the online learning and programs over at Princeton Theological Seminary, including a new seminar series on eco-theology, which I'm excited about, wanted to get to hear about that, and also ask you some questions about deep ecology and deep ecclesiology and all that you were working on in your dissertation. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited about it.
Like, one of the things that you'll be working on in the whole seminar series you're putting together at Princeton is kind of theological education is in the middle of, it's in dramatic transformation, both in ATS, the accrediting groups, always reworking what the degrees look like. Denominations are trying to figure out what to do as you end up with more second career students going into ministry. How do we use hybrid intensives, online, in-person education, and the funding process for it's always changing. So what's kind of the pain point of sorts that the project that you're kind of helping steer at Princeton originates from?
Yeah, I think it's all of that. A major drive is a desire to make theological education more accessible to people that don't have the time and the luxury to have done 1 or 2 degrees already in theology or philosophy or humanity, somewhere in that realm, before getting to learn in a seminary style class space or learning space. So I think that's really the major driving desire, is to just make this more accessible to more different kind of people who don't have the time to dedicate their whole lives to theological education, but want to deepen their understanding of theological texts, of theological topics, whether for their own ministry. There's lots of pastors who didn't get to go to seminary, who, at some point in their career realize I could use some refining on this, that, or the other. And there's lots of, lay people, lay leaders that have the same kind of experience of, like, I've been charged with leading this group of people in my congregation or in my community. I need to shore up what it is, my actual knowledge base, so I know what it is that I'm kind of talking about when people ask me questions, as they inevitably do when you're leading people.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me with the first big seminar thing you're kind of putting on here is looking at eco-theology, and that's a topic that wasn't even on the agenda in a robust way within theological education for a lot of older clergy, and has increasingly been something religious traditions know that we need to reflect on, but exactly how we tackle questions that we wouldn't have known to ask historically until the present challenges show up, all of a sudden are digging back through a religious tradition to ask new questions. So when you think of the task of doing eco-theology in the present, and then doing it with people who may not even be that familiar with the breadth and depth of the Christian tradition, how do you begin to frame the conversation around eco-theology in a kind of online project like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I'm looking forward to having a better answer to after we do a couple of these seminars. I think the way that I'm hoping to approach the seminar that I'm teaching is to kind of do both things side by side, to be introducing major topics, major doctrinal kind of developments in the history of Christian thought, and thinking about them sort of immediately then through the lens of ecology, through the lens of contemporary environmental looming catastrophe, so that they're not seen as two separate things, but it's learning to think these things together. The church obviously has not done a great job, or any job historically, of thinking these things together. I think that's been part of my my research to this point. A lot of my teaching to this point has been presenting both here's what happened in history, in the church's history in itself. Like we don't need to just pretend that the church fathers had ecology in mind, or the church fathers had racial justice in mind, or gender justice in mind, whatever the case may be. We're not going to pretend that that was like always there, because that's not, very obviously not the case. But all of these things are interwoven with our faith today, and so they have these immediate kind of impacts on the way we exist in the real world. So moving very quickly from one to the other, I think helps students who are new to theology, new to these various dimensions of theology, see that this isn't like a stretch. This isn't like, oh, theology in itself is just about God, and then like there's some nature freaks that like to bring in creation to it. But like all of these things are interwoven. Aquinas said, the purview of theology is God and all that is not God. So theology isn't just this cordoned off discipline, but it has these real effects on the concrete world that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my approach sort of to teaching seminary students as well as these seminars. Is let's get our sort of shared background information squared away. Let's get these terms defined. Let's get these historical markers in the church's development defined, why we say we believe this, that, and the other. And as soon as we do that, let's start rolling into how does that affect the way we think about the crises that the world is facing today.
Mm-hmm. So when in your kind of own story did the question of the ecological crisis get to the fore, and then you go, oh, obviously this means I should write a dissertation on it?
The development of my dissertation and a lot of my research has been very autobiographical, in that I started my first postgraduate research work was at the University of Edinburgh. And I went there and spent most of my research there working on psychology and theology, trying to think about sort of some of my own mental health journey, that of my family, that of people that I knew and loved. And I had never received any sort of theologically helpful insight about any of it. I had been given very superficial, very kind of shallow answers by church leaders, by faith leaders in my life. And I just found it utterly unsatisfying. And these two things, theology and psychology, just seemed like complete separate things. But I'm like, that can't be true. Trying to figure out how these things go together. So I started off working on psychological disorder and trying to develop some theological frameworks to think about it. I worked on phobic compulsions, addictions, depression, did several projects trying to think with major theological figures about not just like the diagnostic criteria, but the experience, the phenomenology of these experiences. So I started out, doing anthropology, Christology, soteriology, figuring out what it is to be human, what it means to be saved, how does salvation relate to health, all of these kinds of questions. And what I found over the course of my time at Edinburgh and then starting at PTS was this question just kept getting bigger. It was this question of health and wholeness. And I very quickly realized, I can't actually do just anthropology in itself. I have to think about anthropology in terms of like social context. You can't be healthy inside your own brain. You have to be healthy in a community of people. In order for that to happen, that community of people has to be healthy and whole. I got involved with the Princeton Seminary Farminary project, which is the seminary owns a 20-some acre farm and is sort of working on developing it into a full-scale regenerative farm. So I TA'd a class out there. I got involved working on the farm team, and this question of health just kept getting bigger and bigger as I was exploring some of these questions and then also working in that context and realizing that a human community can't be healthy and whole abstracted from its broader ecological community. So I did some research on ecopsychology. I've been trying to think about ecopsychology and ecotherapy in conversation with theological anthropology, doctrine of creation, etc. And so this question just kept getting bigger and bigger, leading up to my dissertation at PTS, which is on eco-theology, the doctrine of the church, and trying to think ecologically about the doctrine of the church, about salvation, about wholeness in community, both human and non-human. So it was the same question, the same thread that ran all the way through it was the question of health and wholeness, and what it means to be human.
One of the things I noticed about your dissertation and in your story is the way the kind of taking seriously the ecological crisis ultimately involves kind of a constructive movement through a number of different doctrines, and they all kind of layer in and out of each other. In the dissertation, the kind of starting and ending point is in ecclesiology, which is not often the starting point for eco-theology. They tend to focus on things that are in the middle chapters, either like in 4 and 5, or more specifically science-related things, or, let's do deep incarnation and work outwards. Let's redo the doctrine of creation and move around. So I'm interested in the method way, or the process way, how you chose to kind of orient this project in ecclesiology and bring the other kind of doctrines in.
There's several layers, and one of them is autobiographical again, which is that my church, Day Spring Baptist, here in Waco, Texas, which is where I'm back living now, has had a real focus on creation care, our place within broader creation. And one of the things we did as part of that, or a couple of things we did, one was we developed a community composting program. So we're one of only like 3 community composting sites in the county. The other one was our grounds were designated a certified wildlife habitat by the National Wildlife Federation. And thinking about that got me thinking about the status of these non-human creatures in relation to the humans that made up the church. And so I had these sort of, half-formed questions about, like, does that make, the deer that live on our grounds, we have these pretty big grounds, does that make them like part of our church? Does that make them part of the body of Christ? So what in the world would I even mean by that? Like, why am I asking this really weird question? And I realized that a number of ideas had already started to formulate in that regard. And so there's this one sense in which I was trying to make sense out of my own church's being in the world, our sense of vocation to care for the non-human creation around us, and trying to figure out, like, in what sense that changed what we were, or who we were, or pertained to what we are and not just what we do. So that was sort of the cluster of questions that started to spark some of these. And the other dimension is just kind of like you said, no one has thought about ecclesiology from the perspective of ecology and eco-theology. There's tons of anthropology, there's tons of Christology, there's tons of doctrine of creation, obviously, but all of everything that I could find and still have been able to find in the course of researching an entire dissertation is about, like, hey, what are we supposed to do? What is the church supposed to do? What are Christians supposed to do in the face of ecological destruction, the Anthropocene, et cetera, et cetera? And, like, those are obviously well-placed questions. Those are not, like, the wrong questions to ask. But I found that there was this disconnect between what we ought to do and who we are as the church. Like, what is the church, and how do we frame that in terms of the church's relationship to the non-human creation? And the fact that there was just this gap there seemed to me important for the sake of coherence. I'm very much a systematic theologian. Like, I'm not a ethicist. I'm not I didn't set out to be an eco-theologian. In some sense, I would kind of identify myself as that. But in other ways, my concerns are very systematic, to sort of think coherently about the whole logical structure of Christian faith. And so to me, these deep-seated concerns I have for the planet, for creation, for non-human creatures and human creatures affected by sort of ecological catastrophe we're facing, I wanted to work those into a broader systematic schema. And I found it concerning that no one was doing that, specifically with regards to ecclesiology and what the church is.
Yeah. The only other one that comes to mind is one of Joseph Bracken's last books before he passed away was kind of ecologically centered ecclesiology. But there's definitely not, I can think of articles, but not, a whole book treatment. How did you get to having Bonhoeffer as the primary conversation partner for ecclesiology? In many ways, it's easy to see how it works so well in the constructive project, but a lot of the features that you pick up on are stuff from early in his own work, that then there's the whole debate of how they get reworked later in the later writings. And it's one of the places he parts ways more distinctively with some of his peers of sorts in broadly kind of like revelation-centered theology?
Part of this is, again, autobiographical. Bonhoeffer was the first theologian that just like captured my imagination as an undergrad. And so I've always just kind of stuck with him and thought with him. I started thinking about psychology stuff with him and have continued to do so. And so in some ways it just felt very natural. Like I don't have like a phenomenal methodological justification other than like, I don't know, he shapes the way I think. And I found myself wondering if deer can be Christians. So like maybe there's something there. But then there are specific aspects, obviously, of his ecclesiology, especially in Sanctorum Communio, that I found particularly both formative of my understanding of what the church is, but then also open to this ecological recalibration that I try to perform. And especially, as you mentioned, the revelation centered, the way that he holds in tension the church as both an empirical, historical community that's sort of, accessible and interpretable by every other human standard, the standards by which we would measure or describe sociologically any human entity, but at the same time, also a reality of revelation. So the way that he holds these two in sort of this productive contrast, this dialectical tension, I found really helpful. And then the second aspect of his ecclesiology that I just found so amenable to recalibrating the doctrine of the church, as I've tried to do, is that he understands the church as restored humanity and community. And so that became kind of the primary dimension that I pay attention to in sort of the second part of my dissertation, when I start to think kind of about material realities of ecology in the church and how the church fits into restoring ecological community, is that there is no humanity and community that's not ecologically grounded. There's no aspect of human nature. This is kind of what I argue in my anthropology chapter. There's no aspect of human nature that's like separable from or discontiguous from our ecological grounding as creatures, among others. If the church has restored humanity and community, it's also restored humanity and ecological community, and therefore involves more than just humanity, but involves the broader communities by which and through which and in which we exist.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the imaginative piece of the dissertation, is imagining what does it mean to say that like the church as the body of Christ is not just humans, but also includes the renewal of ecological communities that we inhabit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bonhoeffer has this way of talking about the inside and the outside story of the church that you were getting at, like the outside being like the kind of account you could give historically and sociologically about any community, and then say like part of faith also enlivens or awakens one to the inside story of the church, which is where that crisis comes from for him, and seeing, initially like when the Fuhrer principle comes up and he's like, well, what are we doing? The later through his life, the more he becomes aware that part of what his critique is not just towards some aberrant part of modernity, but to the kind of ideological blindness modernity brings in the kind of sweeping anti-Semitism that you see in the Nazis, and the way culture, like the center of culture, moves closer and closer. And like it's in that space where you get the kind of relational ontology that his Christology and his ecclesiology and such work on, where the encounter with the other is the place in which the relationships are taken up into the divine life, and then the orientation towards the other from the view from below and such orients you. So in a sense, I mean, he tends to emphasize the mechanization of modernity and this kind of thing, but the ecological critique, right, like is a kind of an extension of the problem modernity gives us, that you also see represented in Auschwitz and Hiroshima.
Yeah, very much so. Part of his critique of the German idealist tradition is that it sets up a subject-object paradigm in which you can never truly encounter or understand the other as another I or as a you. It creates this I-it paradigm where others are incorporated into the self sense of things. and so therefore objectified. And so exactly like what you're saying, we have to see these things play out in the Holocaust, the ability to objectify the other, to see the other not as thou, but as it. And so part of my project is, and why I found Bonhoeffer so amenable to it, is I'm sort of tweaking and recalibrating the I-you paradigm that Bonhoeffer develops, and just extending it to recognize the reality that like humans don't exist in a vacuum. Not only are we not just minds in a vacuum that are self-generating. This is sort of Bonhoeffer's critique of idealism, but we're also not even like humanity itself is not even self-generating. Who I am is dependent upon and predicated upon other creatures, not just humans, not just social, not just the meeting of two human eyes, two human yous, but the way that we're formed by microbes in our gut, the way that we're formed by the environments in which we exist and our relationship to trees and grass and soil and to other animals. All of these things makes human subject formation possible, and it doesn't. We don't exist without them. So all of our sense of self is dependent upon and predicated upon, and something spread through the non-human creation as well, as much as human to human interaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of expansion of to non-human others and non-human neighbors, it gets redeveloped in your doctrine, the way you redo doctrine of creation at the beginning, and I wonder if you could kind of help those of us that may be more familiar with deep ecology. See the use of saying deep ecclesiology and its connection to deep ecology just within eco-philosophy is a rather, I don't know. I think it's a pretty exciting, set of connections to make. So take some time and introduce us both to like deep ecology, like what is that perspective and how does that kind of enable theological imagination to think about the obligation towards the neighbor to extend past the human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So deep ecology, I mean, very roughly put, is the recognition that like everything is related all the way down. Nothing is abstractable. Everything is profoundly interrelated with everything else on planet Earth. Niels Henrik Gregerson, who I engage quite a bit in my chapter on Christology, has developed the idea of deep incarnation, which you mentioned earlier, and then Elizabeth Johnson picks up on this and talks about deep resurrection and then deep Christology. So deep Christology becomes a sort of catch-all term for all of this. So thinking about what it means to think about what it means to say we exist in this universe on this planet in which everything is profoundly interconnected at the material level. Things are flowing in and out of each other. All of our selfhood, all of our existence is predicated on our relationship to others. How do we talk about the incarnation of Christ in light of that recognition that human nature is not freestanding, that human nature doesn't stand apart from grass and soil and non-human animals, that all this is interwoven. And so Gregerson and Johnson, I think, really beautifully and really helpfully think about how we might understand the incarnation as extending beyond just human nature and sort of penetrating into the material nexus of reality. I have some relatively minor, but still I think important critiques of where they are a bit, there's a little bit of ambiguity in what they say, how they try to answer that question. But for the most part, I just find them beautifully helpful. And so I try to build on that. And then deep ecclesiology is sort of the next step. So my argument is that in the dissertation, the sort of meta argument is that anthropology, Christology, and ecclesiology relate to each other in this particular logical way in Christian thought. That what we say about what a human being is, because of Nicene Chalcedonian Christology, where vere homo, vere deus, Christ is truly human and truly God. What we understand the human to be changes the scope of the incarnation. So whereas, for the church fathers, they're working on primarily sort of an Aristotelian metaphysic where the human being is a body and a soul, a body and a rational soul. They don't have like any Christian ideas about what constitutes a human being ontologically. They're just kind of going, okay, whatever it is that a human is, we have to say God became the fullness of that in Christ in order to redeem the fullness of human nature. So there's not this like prior Christian biblical definition of the human. We're just kind of rolling with what seems like the best scientific and philosophical definition of the day and doing our Chalcedonian logic of like, whatever it is, whatever human is, God became all of that, not just part of that, not just a human body and soul, but not a human mind, not just a human mind, but not a human body, like fully. And that's how God saves humanity. Well, my argument is just in order to remain Orthodox, if we care about the creeds, and we may or may not, but I do, in order to remain sort of true to the logic of creedal orthodoxy, we have to be willing to update our definition of truly human. And we now understand humanity, human nature, to be ecologically constituted in all of these ways, cognitively, emotionally, affectively, microbiologically, physically, evolutionarily. We don't occupy this like separate sphere of creation, but we're fully interwoven with, we exist along a continuum with other creatures. We're constituted by them. So in order to say, if we're going to say that God became human, we have to say that God became human in the same way that the rest of us are human, which is ecologically constituted. So that's my sort of, I add a bit to the deep Christology, the deep incarnation. I have my own sort of upshot there in light of my own anthropological kind of underpinnings. But then the argument is that if our understanding of being human affects our understanding of what it means to say that God became incarnate as human, and with Ferguson and Johnson and Elizabeth Copeland, I talk about what it means to say that by becoming human, God therefore became also more than human. Somehow the incarnation extends into the rest of creation as well. That should also affect how we think about the church. So it's this argument about the relationship, logical relationship between anthropology, Christology, and ecclesiology. That if the church is the body of Christ, then the church corresponds to the nature of Christ. And if Christ, by virtue of being human, is also more than human, then all of these things, we have to think about not just the incarnation, not just human beings as ecological creatures, but also the church as an ecological reality, as a reality that's not confined to the human, whatever we may mean by that, wherever we may think we can draw a boundary between human and not human. I argue that there is no such boundary, but also that if God in Christ has become fully human and therefore is ecologically constituted, then the church must also be human in the same way and be an ecological reality that incorporates not just human flesh or human brains or human bodies, but also created materiality more broadly into the renewal that we see taking place there.
Mm-hmm.
But that was it. I felt like that was a very long answer to a very simple question.
Oh no, well no,
as dissertations are.
Yeah, well, it gets me distracted on questions, which I'm just going to take one detour. We can come back to it because, like, I find the form of the argument beautiful. I don't understand the decision, and you tell me if this is hearing it poorly and thinking it through. Like, a lot of times, now I'm Baptist too, but I grew up when Baptists did not care about the creed. I mean, we mostly complained about it. It didn't get used until Southern Baptists could no longer convince most of their friends that being Orthodox was what the Bible said. So then Al Mohler started caring about a creed after years of complaining about it. So like every prejudice in me is to not care whatsoever unless it makes sense. So, but like what you're doing sounds like you're making a form content distinction on what Orthodoxy is, and saying like the form of the confession, the creedal confession, which you've repeated a number of times, that's normative. The content of it is completely up for grabs based on our current scientific account. But then it also includes virgin conception, which would be a break in evolutionary participation of the forming of life. The Chalcedonian definition keeps adding on to the Apostles' Creed, rejecting the desire for partitioning, right, the divine, and this kind of thing. I always wonder about this because I'm guessing this might be one of the places you would resist what Elizabeth Johnson does. Which, if people are interested, she's been on and the podcast 3 or 4 times or so, and there's one whole one on eco-Christology. But that's to me one of those questions when it goes to science, religion, conversation, connecting to constructive theology. What's the normative element for something like confessions? Because if you keep the form of them, like the language game or whatever, then you can end up with to articulate that the content changes dramatically, because they didn't know we were on a mediocre planet in a solar system and a bunch of galaxies, that there was a
Right.
quantum
Yeah.
fluctuation in the vacuum 13.8 billion years ago. When John uses sarx for the word becoming flesh, he wasn't sitting there going like, well, this would be a really cool way of transcending and including the generative principle of the divine that meets moment to moment through a cosmic advance to eventually have a form of life that has symbolic reflection, and somehow they move energy into their brain so that symbolic forms of communication generate group bonding beyond their kin group, and they're born early and they're still needing to be protected. Like all the things, when I think of what you learned in a class I eventually taught in Edinburgh on social psych and evolutionary psych and all those things, like I'm interested in the drive, because one could make an eco-ecclesiology. You could even keep Bonhoeffer's ontology. Like what's gained by going, I would agree with the form of classical Christology, but its content, which was shaped by a priori philosophical commitments they're trying to explain, we can change that, because now we have a whole different, we aren't using Aristotelian categories, we aren't using Platonic concepts of participation. One of the reasons Protestants have trouble with constructive theology is like the legitimation of confessional commitments is a hard thing to muster unless they're, just so, in a sense, like, oh, these are mine.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. The form content distinction is very much what I'm doing in the dissertation. I think the form, truly human, truly divine, is a sort of creedal authority that I understand myself to stand under and want to stand under.
In your kind of constructive project, like how does the normative nature of the tradition, what kind of like hesitations or demands does it put on you for kind of expanding kind of classical notions of incarnation or image bearing or creation to a level that really kind of elevates other creatures while embedding us more fully?
Yeah, I just, my argument is that this is just like straightforward orthodoxy and doesn't require any sort of heterodox thinking, even if we're just honest with the way we get our knowledge about the world. We don't cling to Aristotelian metaphysics when we go to the doctor, or we don't cling to, any sort of ancient definition of the human when we have to have surgery, or when our life is on the line. We go with contemporary medical understanding of the human body. And so I just think if we're honest with ourselves, we're already doing this already. We ought to be honest and do it in a more thoroughgoing way and allow it to refract back into these sort of core confessional commitments, and say that recognize like, hey, we can have these confessional commitments that are grounded in faith, that are grounded in, we're going to say, response to revelation. They don't have to be unchanging in terms of the content, and they're not. And I think that's the thing. This is, I'm not a huge Bultmann fan. I don't know Bultmann tremendously well, but I like, to a very significant degree, the project of demythologization, and I think Bonhoeffer is building on it in some ways, with in all sorts of ways, especially in letters and papers, religionless Christianity and things along these lines. But that's what I'm also trying to do, is just be like, we can't exist in the world in the way that we do and still pretend that we believe that a human is a mind and a rational soul and also different from the rest of creation in some way. Like all of our medical knowledge, all of the ways that we exist in the world are predicated on Darwin. They're predicated on understanding of the microbiome that I spent a similar amount of time on. They're all all of these are grounded in this ecological understanding of human nature. And so I just think we ought to be honest, and we ought to find ways to, those of us who are, committed to the creeds, committed to something like Orthodoxy, at least, we ought to be honest with ourselves about this and find ways to redescribe, to recalibrate our doctrinal confessions that just make for a coherent kind of faith and existence in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I think to a lot of people, and as I've taught seminarians, is a very scary kind of thing to propose that, like, hey, we are holobiont creatures, and there's more microbial cells in your body than human cells. And did Jesus have a microbiome? Was the microbiome also assumed by God? Like, these are kind of scary questions for seminarians, for people who have just started thinking about the creeds in themselves, much less like then trying to apply it to all these other things. But I don't think they ought to be. I think they ought to just be like part of my what I wanted to accomplish with the dissertation, and eventually with the book version of it, is sort of performing the argument that, like, systematic theology ought to be ecologically oriented. Like, there's no reason it shouldn't be. And if we're going to be relevant or coherent, it has to be, because we're just fooling ourselves if we think we can continue to do theological anthropology and Christology and soteriology and all the rest without accounting for what we know our place in the universe to be at a material level. So to me, all things are open so long as we can fit the content into the form. And I think there are versions of the content that wouldn't really fit the form. I just think that ought to be, theology ought to be done with this freedom to sort of improvise and to play with the content, so long as we, submit to the form. And by the way, I don't think all theologians think this. I don't think you have to submit to the form of Chalcedon and Nicaea to do good theology. That's just sort of my confessional starting point. It's like, yeah, this is where I'm starting. And I think we ought to be able to function with a lot more freedom than we think we can, or than we are inclined to give ourselves and others.
Oh, I would love for you to convince your peers that's the case. One of the things that I think is entailed in that, in a sense, right? Like, so to even give the example of Jesus' microbiome being assumed, the microbiome of human beings today is significantly different than that was on the time of Jesus. So, like, has our microbiome been assumed? If that which hasn't been assumed hasn't been redeemed. Or you could ask the question in the same way, right, with the ongoing transformation of humans through technology, or when we end up speciating, or ending up on human life or conscious life morphs to silicone base. Like, there's so many things entailed in the moment the content form of the theological confession is accountable to the content of our world in the present, that it seems like in some way it creates a possibly increasing gap between the historical event of the person Jesus and the normative form of human being in the present. Say, like, most people weren't even literate, so the way they structured their brain and related to the world was extremely different, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I draw on Rebecca Copeland's work, and the title of her Created Being is her book, to talk about the line that matters in the incarnation is not human and not human, but God and not God. So in the incarnation, yes, God takes on human flesh in Jesus of Nazareth, but in so doing, the line is not the line that matters is not where the human ends and where the non-human begins, but the line is crossing between God and not God. So Copeland talks about, the Nicene Creed being the first, they're not trying to do this necessarily, but becomes the first affirmation of the infinite qualitative distinction between God and not God. And the fact that the live question is, was Jesus God in the same way that the Father is God, or was Jesus, a first and highest creation? And so what Nicaea says is, like, no, Jesus, in order to save, has to be fully God in the same way that the Father is God. And in so doing, they basically say there's two ousias, there's two modes of being, ultimately. There's divine ousia and created ousia. And Jesus has to be on the divine side of that absolute divide. And so in my own Christology chapter, and the way I'm thinking about these things, that's sort of the primary like ontological question involved in the incarnation, in the redemptive effects of the incarnation. The nature taken on by Jesus is not human, but creature. Now he's a human creature, and I think that this matters for understanding of Revelation in particular. But by becoming human, Jesus became creature, and it was a human creature that he became, and that has implications. But in terms of the salvific and revelational aspect, in terms of the salvific aspects, the line that matters is between God and creature, not human and not human.
Most eco-theologies, one of the places that you'll get tension in a space like this is on the preservation of a quantitative difference between God and the world. So like a lot of the earlier eco-theologies are variations of panentheisms, different kind of process relational ones, and that kind of thing. But one of the things that, I mean, even about how she describes the creed, like to say like Nicaea is the place where you get a document that's affirming quantitative distinction, that this is might just be being very Baptist. That would mean that the biblical texts themselves don't have that, and it took hundreds of years of reading them under the conditions of a metaphysics that's outdated by the very science you're trying to include in your form-content distinction. It took reading text to then to interpret the text to have a conclusion that now the form of that conclusion is normative, but the content isn't. So it's like the theological form gets to evolve till we get to one place, and now it's arrived. So the rest of the time we just get to come up with new ways of expanding what the form of the confession means, so we can keep reread the tradition. And it just seems like you're giving a kind of metaphysical compliment to a linguistic form, while saying like the very distinction that the reading the whole tradition and being taking its form seriously didn't exist for the first. Paul, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John were running around talking game, and then they finally had Nicaea tell them how to understand the incarnation. Then to go, oh, well, the gospel actually precedes the text itself, right? The incarnation would have happened before there were any texts, let alone interpretations of the text and going back to it. And so the fascinating thing to me about a kind of like what you're doing is the very places a lot of earlier eco-theology thought, oh, how do we think through this? Part of it was forms of deep incarnation that are much more emergent forms of incarnation, evolutionary Arianism. That's what I was told one of my Christology books were a form of. And usually the critique is something like, well, this thing that's not entailed or required by reading scripture, we decided a couple hundred years later this is what it really means. And so we're just going to now try to squeeze biblical criticism and contemporary science into a form of a confession, because we just, like, I guess that was what the real providence of God was when we got to the correct articulation of the doctrine, not the actual people encountering the person Jesus, witnessing to it, the evangelists and stuff. Well, it needed some maturation, needed evolution, but just needed evolution until.
Yeah, I think there's an important, and it's that I kind of tried to get at this, and I got in the process of writing a dissertation, you don't get to do the things that you want to do. So I kind of got stuck on the methodological distinctions in the dissertation itself. But I just want to go, theology is not about truth. Theology is about our best approximation of making sense with our language games of what happened. And I think we're probably not going to get any better than Nicaea at the general level. Like Nicaea to me says like, this is sort of the baseline, our best interpretation here. And to me, it just is the best interpretation. Jesus is fully divine, fully human. I don't think Nicaea, like, it's probably, eschatologically, I think we're going to look at Nicaea and go, we tried our best. But I do just think it's the best. Like, I think it's the best, so, like, in terms of holding together the logics of Christian faith. I just think it's like, yeah, this is authoritative in the sense that, like, it lets me make the most sense out of all the things. Not authoritative in the sense of, like, nobody had it until then and nobody's gotten it better since then. But just like, yeah, this is, it's pretty good. And like, this is what I'm going to work off of, because this seems to make the most sense of the world I live in. So like, yes and no, I guess, to your longer question. Like, yeah, this is a language game. And I see it as, I just decided to play by those rules.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting with the role of revelation in it that you would say, like, theology is not about truth, but then self-revelation or constructive thought about the self-revelation of God, the what's normative is the human linguistic construction about it. You see why that's a bit confusing?
Yeah. But I mean, how else do we construct human norms? We have linguistic norms, and we go, okay, this is what we're doing. So I think there's a bit of a pragmatism there of just like I don't there. Yes, there's like a tension there, but to me, I kind of go, yeah, no, revelation is truth. Theology is our best approximation of responding. It's our best response to it. And so revelation is the life and person of Jesus. And theology is the language game that we sort of agree to play by these rules in order to try to make sense out of it. And I think as long as you can hold that tension, you can do whatever you want with theology, which is not to say that theology is not important and that theology isn't striving for truth, but like revelation is truth. Theology is the language game. And like, in order to think coherently as a group, whether the group is theologians or Christians or humans, whatever, like, yeah, we got to have some rules. And like, to me, these are the rules that seem to make most sense. So I'm going to go from here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My suspicion on the tradition is so much higher than that. I just get if you weren't Baptist, I probably wouldn't have talked about this at all. You realize that? Like,
sure.
People are like, why do you give Baptists such a hard
You would have been like, yeah,
I'm like, well, fine. I complain about all my Anglican friends for saying stuff like this. I just roll my eyes in my head and go, be polite. But Baptists still always this. I mean, I've had this conversation with one of my old professors, Steve Harmon, who is big on this stuff, and I would just tell him, I'm like, look, you're giving authority to a very tradition that said like the very basics of being Baptist are wrong. Like, they don't believe in believers' baptism. There's no salvation outside the church. Like, go through all the crap that's in there and it's like, how much of it do you trust? Well, this one document. And when did Baptists start caring about it? The moment like modern criticisms via science and biblical studies made them uncomfortable around inclusion of women first, inclusion of LGBTQ, around race things. That's when white dudes in the South started to care about the creed again. And that's why that's 100% why I've never taken the thing seriously, because the people that did it were the ones that kicked out large chunks of Baptists. And I'm like, y'all didn't care about this stuff. And it's surprising you know how many things they said at those councils other than the creeds that you make fun of in worship services? A lot. So it's not like that historical moment's normative. It's literally those lines, because it's like how you're a Christian, even the fruits of the Spirit, participate, like the number of things at those councils that they taught. And nope, those aren't authoritative, just these things. And I'm like, well, that's that's there. But sorry for going on diatribes. I
like a diatribe.
Well, one of the other things that by taking the tradition, well, I guess a couple hundred years into the tradition structure is normative, then in many ways it allows the constructive theologian in the present to function in kind of a jazz orientation towards it, right? Where it's like, well, here's the boundaries, here's the structure. What is this? How does this language generate relational dynamics within the person's orientation towards the divine economy, mission, this kind of thing? And now let's be creative in the content side of things, so you can have like a expansive and expanding elements within the Christian tradition. Well, you tell me which one it was, but it seems to me that for, like, as you run back through the doctrines through ecclesiology, it's the expansion around incarnation and creation that expresses the vision of the church as normally inherited in this context?
So for me, one of the things that the deep ecclesiology that I try to develop does is it solves what I think is something of a problem with Gregerson and Johnson and deep Christology, which is that on their accounts, you're kind of left with just a big question mark in the present. On the account of deep incarnation, Gregerson is kind of a moving target sometimes. Sometimes Christ is the deep incarnation means that Christ is present in, with, and under. And sometimes it means by having, so there's a sort of Lutheran sacramental, more or less statically sacramental quality to creation. And then sometimes deep incarnation means by entering into, the material nexus of creation and experiencing creaturely life from the interior. It's as though God is present. God has experienced all creatures' pain and suffering. The question mark that I kind of find then is like, okay, well, how do we know where or when we're ever seeing God in creation? Like Gregerson is very careful, and I think very rightly so, to say like God is not omni-manifest. So, Christ is incarnate in all creation for Gregerson, but Christ is not omni-manifest. We can't look at everything around us and say, there's Christ. Christ isn't revealed in the horrors of creation, which is Marilyn Robinson, right? So for me, I'm left with this question of like, how do we perceive God in the more than human creation? Where can we hope to, or can we at all ever hope to distinguish between God revealed in creation and creation not revealing God? Like, what's the line? And so to me, the deep ecclesiology sort of answers that question that I have of Gregerson and Johnson, that the church is the site of God's self-revelation through the restoration of humanity and community. So this is Bonhoeffer. The church understood as ecological community, renewed ecological community, says God can be and is revealed through the renewal of ecological community, not just exclusively human community, so that we can look for and expect to find God's self-revelation in the renewal of these ecological relationships. And so chapters 4 and 5 do quite a bit of the ecological description. Like here's how ecosystems function. Here's how humanity and human sin destroys ecosystems. So I kind of think about ecological destruction and the register of sin. And then the last chapter is the development of this deep ecclesiology. Like, how then can we understand God's self-revelation taking place in the church as the more than human body of Christ? And I propose that it's through these sort of renewed ecological relationships that I think we can expect to be manifest in the life of the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was really interested in the sin element in general. Can you kind of like describe, because that's one of those words that even in traditions that use the creeds regularly, if it's not in the liturgical prayers itself, you'll see that the frequency of the word sin dissipated, like in the way you kind of ground the concept theologically in an ecological way. I think it actually like gives the ability of rehabilitating language and the reality, and right, like what you're confessing is actually related to one of the more pressing problems for the flourishing of life.
Yeah, so I draw on Bonhoeffer in his theology of sin, and I develop a theology of sin as ecological in curvature. So it's very Augustinian, Lutheran, Bonhoefferian in curvature of the self, the core women say, heart turned in on itself, self turned in on itself. To talk about our orientation away from God and others as that for which we're created. We're created for communion, community, love between ourselves and God and others, the one not without the other. This is especially Bonhoefferian language, Bonhoefferian trajectory. I draw on Amina Alatas Bradford. I don't know if you know Amina. She did her dissertation at Duke a few years ago on the holobiont concept in theology. So it's a holobiont theology. And so I draw on her and to put her in conversation. She has a reading of the fall story as turning to the wrong tree, rather. That the fall is not just that Adam and Eve tried to be like God, but it's also that they turned away by eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but they also turned away from the other tree, the tree of life, which is a non-human creature through which God has, deigned to give the gift of life to humanity. So we receive our life from other creatures. And so for Altitas Bradford, it's turning to the wrong tree, turning from the tree of life to the tree of knowledge, is a denial of our ecological dependence, and a denial of the fact that we have our life in relation to God, but also through other creatures, and those aren't separable from each other. So I kind of put her in conversation with Bonhoeffer to develop this idea of ecological and curvature, that the fall is not just a turning away from God and other humans, but it's a turning away from God, others, and the non-human creatures from whom we have our lives. And the effect is this just in curvature. It's now, instead of being oriented to all that gives us life and all for which we are created, we're turned inward on ourselves individually as humans, but also as a species. So we come to see kind of reflexively non-human creatures as less than, as threats, as extractable resources. And such that the effect of turning away from other creatures is our fallenness now means that we are reflexively turned away from the creatures that would give us life, and through whom God has always intended to give us the grace of life. So then I read sort of contemporary ecological destruction through that lens, and some like the specific ways in which we're actively destroying the ground of our life.
Mm-hmm. The way that, I guess, all chapters 3 through 11 in Genesis get kind of picked up in creation and the fall, it's fascinating how Bonhoeffer gives a number of those little asides, which basically hint at the function of technology, the emergence of technology as a forms of controlling the rest of creation, and be it the advent of agriculture, the building of the tower, these kinds of things, that technology increases the alienation of humanity from the land and from other species. Him wrestling with that early on in those lectures, and then picking it up in letters and papers for his more general critiques at modern technological transformations. Yeah, that's really cool. I never thought about the connection between the way he does creation and the fall, technology, and that kind of stuff, and then the larger desire for control that humans have always had, but we keep leveling it up. The more power we potentially have for extraction and control of nature, the more we get to, right? And that's how you get to something like the critique in deep ecology of even could we tell the story of our planet? Would it be more beautiful if we just weren't here, right? To raise that kind of question is the polar opposite of a kind of hyper individualistic account of the human. And kind of Western Christianity dialed up to ugly, right? Is could we tell the story of salvation without a creation to begin with? And that kind of the move of a deep ecclesiology is kind of re-embedding humanity in creation, and in doing so, kind of reinvigorating the call towards responsibility for our place in the larger web of life.
Yeah, and it's changing the way we see our relationship to the natural world, and not just our creaturely relationship, but also our redeemed relationship to the rest of creation. If Christ redeems all of human nature in its entirety, that by definition includes everything else too, because you can't separate us from our ecological relationality. Our very selfhood, our entire being is ecologically constructed, is stitched into the rest of the world. So you can't just save us without all of it. Thinking about salvation, and again, for Bonhoeffer, that's why I find him so helpful, that the church is the site of redeemed humanity because it's the site of restored human community. If we can get our heads around the fact that we're ecologically structured all the way down, then that just by definition has this huge implication for what it means to understand human restoration human restoration is always also more than human restoration. And so the goal of the deep ecclesiology project is not, I propose a lot of sort of practical implications, but it's to change how we see what we are more than to change what we're doing. I think the two go together, but I think so often the sort of dire urgency under which ecotheology is done jumps from just jumps straight to the planet's burning. What do we do? Without defining, who we is, whether we just means everyone, whether we means Christians in particular ought to do X, Y, or Z. But then I just think there's a gap. There's a sort of coherence gap of like why. And one of the things I talk about, there's a couple of methodological moves that I do. One is that I focus on ecological community as the scale, ecological communities in the sort of technical ecological sense, rather than like planetary conditions, because I just think starting from the ground up changes the scope of our focus and changes not only how we see ourselves, but what we understand ourselves as able to do. So rather than starting with like global climate change, I focus on like local ecological communities and how they are destroyed through human activity. That, of course, builds up to global climate change, the global Anthropocene, and then all the global effects in turn have dire effects and consequences for local ecological communities. But I think it's actually kind of important to teach people to think locally and not just at a planetary scale, because none of us can do anything about anything on a planetary scale.
Oh, we could worry about it,
but we can
develop cynical.
We can worry about it, yeah,
and feel
and get mad about it. And so this is being Baptist, right? Is that
I can tweet about it?
Totally. This is being Baptist, though, right? Like going to Edinburgh and then PTS. I've been around a lot of mainliners, and it seems like just like every year, every 2 years, whenever they have their denomination, whenever the national denominational meetings happen, everyone comes out of it like, we didn't divest from fossil fuels. We didn't do X, Y, or Z to combat climate change. And it's like, well, you can just do stuff. Like, you don't have to wait for like the national, denominational body to decide to do that. Like, you can just do stuff. You and your local congregation can do stuff. And it's not like, it matters that we do things from both ends. It matters that we go from the ground up and from the top down. But like, I saw this very like resigned, like, well, they didn't decide to do anything, so now what? Whereas there's like the Baptist in me was like, oh, well, my congregation can do these things. And like, no, it's not going to save the planet, but like, it's doing what I think we're called to do, in like doing what's in front of us, taking responsibility, not for the whole world, but for our little slice of it. And so that's a sort of like a methodological move that I make, is like thinking at the level of the local ecological community and what it means for renewal to take place in local ecological communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the kind of ecology and faith groups I got to speak at, they organize around watersheds and then do ecumenical work in that way. And I think there's some fun.
Is that Ched Myers has the watershed Christianity, watershed discipleship. Yeah.
And I think that like, even right, like, how do we think about structuring ourselves locally? Like a watershed is a very specific way of partitioning existence. When you think of the kind of constructive work and these and kind of practical outputs, and ones that you've either thought up or been a part of, and then the possibility of connecting online with people to think through it theologically, like what does developing a kind of ecological imagination, what are its potentials for within congregational life?
Yeah. So this is one of the things this is sort of, I think, in many ways, the upshot of the seminar that I'll be doing, and it's in some ways the upshot of the dissertation as well, is thinking through like, okay, what can you actually do? I say somewhere in the dissertation, like, lots of congregations care about creation in theory. Very few of us have any idea how to stop actively destroying the planet or the ecological communities that we're part of. So like, in order to understand how you can participate in ecological renewal at the local level, you have to understand how ecosystems and ecological communities function. You have to have some of the basic principles of ecology. You have to have a basic understanding of them. And then you have to have a basic understanding of what we're doing that is harming them. And then you have to have a basic understanding of, okay, ecological renewal is not just stopping the harm, but there are ways in which we can participate in building biodiversity, in supporting ecological succession, in concrete ways on our church grounds, in our broader communities, on our private members, individual members' property. There are ways that you can make, a measurable difference to your local ecology by what plants you use in your landscaping, by what trees you plant or don't plant, by what kind of species you include or don't include, by when you mow your grass or how you mow your grass or how long you mow your grass or what, if you mow the leaves or if you leave the leaves. All these sort of aesthetic things that we think of as very secondary. Part of the vision of deep ecclesiology is forming Christians and congregations to understand these as like fundamental ways of being in the world. And so the seminar will talk about sort of basic ecosystem principles, basic principles of how they're being destroyed, and basic restoration principles of like, here's how churches could concretely do this. Here's how churches can enrich the habitat that their grounds provide for native flora and fauna, so that we can contribute to this broader renewal that's necessary, or everything's going to crumble, but also because it puts us back in right relation with non-human creatures. It puts us back in right relation with ourselves and with each other and with God. All of those relationships are inseparable from one another. So the way that we manage our church grounds is not separable from the way that we worship. These two things, all these things go together. And so what I hope that the seminar does, and what I've tried to do in the dissertation, and I think we'll try to do further as it gets turned into the book, is just foster this practical imagination. That's not just a list of like things to do, but it's a list of ways to rethink our being in the world, rethink what it means to relate properly to other creatures, not in this sort of like idealistic, we could go back before industrialism and colonialism and capitalism, because we can't go back. There's no going back for anybody.
Well, I would just hope we can go beyond, right? Like that's
yeah, and that's what I try to do with Bonhoeffer. Is Bonhoeffer, the church isn't going back to pre-fall. The church is a fundamentally new thing that's analogous to created humanity. So it's this constant it's not the denial of sin or its synthesis into, it's not a synthesis of creation and fall, but it's this fundamentally new thing that God has done in Christ. And so my argument is that we ought to think about ecological renewal in the same way. That ecological renewal is not just like, we can go live on a compound and we can get off grid and we can, do regenerative ag and that's, we can get back. That's, I think, a very dangerous kind of romantic impulse. We have to move beyond. We have to find ways to exist after the destruction and redeem it and renew it.
Well, what does that look like, say, in your own life? I know you talk about even in your bio, talking about urban agriculture, regenerative land use. What has attempting to do that on your own helped you understand of the kind of connections that are helpful in doing that within the community? What can be facilitated or encouraged by faith communities? Even what does it look like trying to do it when you got kids running around and stuff like that?
Yeah. Some of the things that, and we just have like a small city lot. We bought a house. We moved back to Waco 3 years ago, and I've not been able to do even a fraction of what I dream of doing. But to me, it looks like planting a bunch of native plants, as many as I can fit in the garden beds, extending the garden beds. I've killed off like the St. Augustine turf grass by just not watering it, and planted some native buffalo grass that doesn't need any water to survive and needs one watering a week to be green all summer. It means trying to grow as much of my own food as possible to be even just a fraction less reliant on the agricultural systems that we're dependent on that are destroying the planet. And like, that's not going to save the planet. My little yard is not going to save anything, but I find that it has rewired my brain and my understanding of my place within creation, to where when I look at my yard, I don't look for like neatly manicured perfection, but I'm looking for bugs. I'm looking to see if there's caterpillars, because if there's caterpillars, there's an entire local ecosystem that can be built up from that lowest trophic level. So native plants bring caterpillars. Caterpillars feed birds. Caterpillars feed birds, which have which distribute seeds from berries and other native plants. And so the more caterpillars you have this sort of trophic cascade upwards that allows for local ecological renewal. So there's these sort of practical steps that you can take that, like, they're not going to change the planet. They're not going to save the world. But they might change your little slice of it. They might provide shelter and haven for other of God's creatures. And it also will just rewire the way you think about what it means to be a creature. If you think of your responsibility as a homeowner or a land manager, not to sculpt perfectly crafted gardens or bring in exotic, interesting things to look pretty, but to facilitate the life of a local ecosystem. It just kind of changes everything about how you think about what a human's role is in relation to these other creatures.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's cool. And so in the online kind of, what's the kind of interaction, what are the different forms of interaction for people that are a part of the seminar series?
So the seminar series will be 4 weeks. It'll be 2 hours. I think it's Tuesday evenings in October. So we'll have some lecture. I'll sort of, we'll have prior readings, that'll be, mostly, if not entirely, theological. And then some of my lecture time will be spent, providing these sort of basic definitions, basic understandings of ecological community, ecosystem function, how these function, how they're destroyed, and then sort of practical, here's how we participate. We'll also have, at least half of each session will be a seminar style discussion. Depending on how big it is, we'll probably divide into groups so that participants can have some really good conversation. They're not just listening to me, because you could just buy a recording of somebody smarter and more interesting than me telling you the same things. But to provide a space for participants to discuss these things with others who have self-selected into this really specific theological inquiry. And I think my hope is that can generate some forms of community. They can generate mutual helpfulness and response and ideas, that it can give people a sense that they're not alone in caring about what happens to the natural world. I think probably for a lot of pastors and a lot of leaders, they may feel like they're the only people at their church that have even thought about this. And so hopefully the seminar can be a space of hope and excitement and a recognition that you're not alone, even if you don't know how to communicate this to other people in your immediate context. That's one of the things that I hope the course does, is give you some language, give you some ideas, and give you some imagination for taking this back to your congregation or your community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for hanging out on the internet and not just talking about your dissertation, but having to tolerate my rather long aside on theological method.
I love it.
Well, yeah. Well,
I mean, I don't agree with it, but I love it. I love to listen to it.
You don't even agree with yourself? This is
actually, I probably do agree with actually like 90% of what you said. I just kind of go, yeah, that's fine. We got to do a language game somewhere.
Okay. Then, how do you read Bonhoeffer's rather critique of the classical Christian language in Letters and Papers?
I think I read him as doing something pretty similar to Bultmann. That like, hey, we're using language that doesn't make sense to people. We're using language we're not even using it in the same way that it was used originally. Like, what are we doing here? Why are we pretending to speak a language or play a language game that we're not even part of anymore? And I think that's the sort of frightening, but also really freeing thing about theology is if we can recognize this, if we can say like, yeah, no, we're talking in a language that is and would be completely incomprehensible to the church fathers, to the authors of scripture. And it's like, yeah, that's part of being human, is that we're constantly changing and developing and navigating the language games. And if we can just acknowledge that, But I think we can do theology a lot more amicably. I think we can do theology a lot more creatively and constructively, and we can do it more ecumenically as well. To just go like, yeah, if you can just acknowledge that, like, we're all doing our own language games, and we're doing our best to respond to this thing that we're all saying we're pointing to, this revelation, then we can think together to a certain point, and then we go, okay, yep, we diverge here, and that's fine. Let's find ways where we can continue to come back to one another. And I just think that's such an important part of the theological task. And part of the task of the theologian is communicating that to people, for pastors, for parishioners, for lay leaders, to teach people to recognize this, that like theology, and this is something that I continue to love about Bart, that like theology is in service to the church. Theology is not the word of God. Theology is critical reflection on the word of God so that we can better proclaim and better speak about that word. And I think we lose sight of that really quickly when we cling too tightly to my language game or my tradition's language game as the right one.
Mm-hmm. All righty. Hey, thanks for making it all the way through the end of this episode. If you are enjoying listening to Dr. Davidson and saying to yourself, whoa, you know, it'd be cool reading, hanging out with him online, reflecting with this, getting some lectures, starting to have small group chats and all that kind of stuff, then check out the class he's putting on, the 4-week class starting in October, Christ, Creation, and the Church, Explorations in Eco-theology. It's going to be a good old time, and you are invited. Smoochy boochies, friends.